this is going to be a hard conversation. It's going to be a very hard conversation, um, especially for a lot of the Christians that are listening. For those specifically Christians that are listening, um, I know what the temptation is going to be when listening to Dolan's story. The temptation is going to be, oh, well, that's terrible. It's tragic. It's awful that stuff like that happens, but that would never happen around me. That would never happen in my congregation. That would never happen in my faith community or in my neighborhood or my family. You're going to look for reasons and excuses to dismiss, disregard, or excuse what happens to him and not really take it seriously as something that could potentially happen around you. That's part of the problem. And Dolan and I were talking about this before the show started. The reason why he wants to come on programs like mine and connect with and partner with people like me is because the only way that real change takes place around this issue, specifically for it taking place and existing within religious communities, faith communities, is if people within those communities take it seriously and we're more aware of it and we're honest about it. So having conversations like this, trigger warning, viewer warning, whatever you want to call it, this is going to be a difficult conversation. It's going to have a lot of stuff in it that's hard to hear, not just because I had the mic muted. It's going to be hard to hear because it's difficult. It's a difficult topic, but it's important. And the only way that we can do better at making sure that stuff like what happened to Dolan, and we'll get into that, doesn't happen to other people, is if we can learn from his experience, allow him to have a voice, listen to him without being dismissive about it, and just assuming that, oh, no, that's terrible, but that would never happen with me, to me, around me, and acknowledge the fact that this does happen and is happening in church congregations and families of faith all across the globe. And we need to be aware of it. We need to learn from stories like Dolan and be part of the solution. So with that said, Dolan, welcome to the program. I'm glad to have you here. Sorry about that little technical snafu. That was extremely embarrassing. But
well, now we're back on track. I want to say thanks for having me on the show, and also thanks for doing the show. This is I spent the whole afternoon while I was working, as I was installing, I was listening to the last 3 episodes. And what really struck me is right before I came on the show, I saw the set of statistics that were talking about the decline in church membership. And really what I see is that it is child abuse survivors who have been leading the movement out of the church, beginning with the Catholic sex abuse scandals. And then if you just look at the last shows that you did, is the purity culture and the number of people that were harmed by that. And then we have another person who was raised in the church and was openly gay, and all of the trauma that he had as a child around his sexual identity. And then the cult of the charismatic Christianity with Oz.
Yeah.
You know, this is the thing, is that what you just said is totally correct, is that I would really like for people who are still in the church to think about the fact that outside the church, I don't want to convince anyone that I'm correct. I want to say that right off the bat. I don't want you to think that I'm correct. What I want you to do is to understand the perspective of people who are outside the church, because I am getting literally inundated with invitations from churches to come back to church. And a lot of them are specifically being targeted at me because of my identity as a survivor of child abuse or as a survivor of religious abuse. And so I think that church members are it's starting to dawn on them that the people that are leaving are leaving not because they're going out of the church to sin because they're interested in drinking or carousing, but because
all those different accusations.
There's something behind that. So I want to kind of focus people's mind on the fact that I'm here really trying to help. I'm no longer a Christian, but I was raised in the church. At one time I was involved in ministry. I've done prison ministry. I've been a worship leader. I've done, men's group fellowship. So, I've studied the Bible. I've had my own crisis of faith, and I've worked my way through that, and I've arrived at this point. And so another thing that I really want to talk about as we're working through the things that happened to me as a child, I'm reviewing a book right now by John Rosemond, and he is a famous Christian parenting expert who writes in the newspaper. And there are a lot of people that are looking around the country and saying we need to have a return to Christian values and parenting. We need to have a return to the Judeo-Christian ethics.
Yeah.
And so I want to convey to people that for me, my perspective on that is that I was severely abused by my parents at the direction of a pastor, and that culturally I was embedded within an entire community that normalized that. And so that has caused me really to look at that entire situation in a way that is really, I know, the complete opposite of how many people see it.
Yeah.
And
your association with that, and saying, hey, we need to go back to a season of Christian values, Christian ethics, and like.
Well, it would just. I'm saying it would be really.
That's triggering helpful for you. Yeah,
it would be really helpful for Christians who are trying to do that type of outreach to have some perspective on the people who've left and what their reasons are for leaving, and also on, as someone that has been. I left the church and I effectively was reparented, in years of psychotherapy. And so where I see evangelicals saying that all this new psychotherapy is no good, it doesn't work. Well, it rescued me. I left from the church injured and emotionally wounded and unable to function. And then it was not from the church that I found help in a place to get healing, but actually through secular counseling. And even when I came forward as an advocate and began trying to advocate to protect other children, when I got healthy enough that it wasn't about me anymore, it was about helping the next generation that are coming up behind me. Who's rallying behind me are atheists and humanists and other people outside of the church. And so that stunned me, because just
a lot of people who are probably survivors of and resonate with your story.
This is right. Is what's happening is that because it's not because the people in the church are horrible people. It's because there's a lack of understanding of the perspective of a minority. This is a small minority of people in the church that have this experience. But for the small minority that have that experience, it's such a profound experience that there's no way to talk or argue or explain around it.
Right.
It can only be understood and accepted. That's the only way to approach it. And so what happens is that when you remove, if you are a secular parent right now, only a minority of secular parents approve of doing corporal punishment at all. And so when you take that out, the necessity to defend the need of spanking, if you took that out of your logic, then that affects how you look at child abuse prosecutions and how you look at how to do child protection. And if you take out of it the need to defend the record of the church, the fact that the church has recommended things that a lot of people have been criticizing for a long time, means that the necessity to defend the dogma, the tradition, and the reputation of the ministries and so forth, if you subtract that from it, then you can look at the facts. So what happens is, outside of the Christian community, survivors find communities that are willing to consider their story without considering whether it is negative toward the church or whether it affects these other issues, but just whether it's a true story.
Right.
And so we find support there, and then consequently churches are bleeding members. So what's happened is we've actually led many more people where it was dismissed as this is such a teeny tiny little number of kids that experience this negative side effect from what we're doing, that it's not worth all of the other people in the ministry not going without the benefit. But you see, that was the same thing that was said about Boy Scouts.
Right.
Is that we have a small number of victims and a large number of people who benefit. But in reality, what has happened is that by neglecting the small number of victims, that tiny number of victims have led the entire culture out of their ministry.
Exactly.
They are bankrupt. Their insurer is bankrupt. And here they're standing and trying to invite people back in.
And the reality is injustice is injustice, period. Like that's, and the more aware that we are of stuff like this being traumatic and traumatizing and having that kind of devastating impact on people psychologically and physically, and might I even argue spiritually, the response that the church has to it speaks largely to the greater audience that is looking at that and wondering and debating whether or not we're going to support this group of individuals, this church, this congregation, this organization. If something like this is happening within their community and they're not responding in a way that is clearly the best way to intervene and interject and put a stop to it, then who's going to want to partner with them and support them?
That's
correct.
The
kind of organization, right? So
and this is the thing, is that it really needs to hit home to people that right now 55% of Americans are saying that they believe that religion does more harm than good.
And you're right. And that's statistics that come up from actually legit,
right? But if you don't
understand,
if you don't understand though that this is coming from these abuse scandals, that the belief that these people do not have legitimacy morally for the claims that they're making and all of the rest, and it's particularly among younger people. When you look at millennials, well, as the church has lost their credibility on parenting and on child abuse and on their response to these scandals, it has led more and more people away. So I do not want, the first thing is you're way more negative on the church than I am. So congratulations. We've just flipped.
I'm used to that though, to be honest with you.
I'm
very charitable.
I work in a community that is all retirement people. So I meet old Christian people every day. And if you meet me for 5 minutes, I'm going to tell you that I'm an atheist and that I have post-traumatic stress disorder from witnessing and experiencing domestic violence. It is so profoundly affecting to me. It causes me to be unable to work about 5 days a month. And so I have to create for myself a job or employment that allows me to work with the disability that I have, because on average, I'm very reliable. But in the short term, something that I encounter that is upsetting, even normal kinds of stress that people take for granted that I'm supposed to be able to handle, a lot of times I'm not able to. And it's because of the constant chronic stress that's brought about by the abuse that I went through when I was a youngster.
Yeah.
So the thing that I'll say though is that the benefit is that by meeting people, I meet so many Christians face to face, and they're grandmas and grandpas. They're people that are my parents' age, if my father was still alive. And these people are very kind and interested in me and in my story. They're willing to listen, and they're reasonably minded. They're not extremists. They're not calling for children to be tortured. They're horrified by what they hear.
Right.
So I want for everybody who's watching me right now to know that my heart is really for you, that I believe in you, that you're a great person, and that you're not a child abuser, that your church is not recommending that people abuse children. I don't believe anything like that. I'm here to help children who are being abused by people who are taking advantage of ignorance. And so by having knowledge about what the problem is, I want everyone to know that where the message that you may get from listening to the church is that this is hopeless. These children, we don't know where they are. No one sees them. There's nothing that we can possibly do to help. My message to you is that I have simple things that you can do. You yourself can do at your church and in your home that are going to make these children safer. And I'm talking about children who are the most endangered victims of child abuse, the children who are the victims of the most severe, long-term, fatal child abuse. You can help them by changing the way that you parent and changing the way that your pastor talks. Not how everybody in the church parents, but about how you communicate. And so when you understand that in sexual abuse prevention, the single most important thing that we do now is we recognize that when it comes down to it, it's the victim and the offender alone in a room. There's no adults there to protect them. And so self-rescue, just like we teach infants how to rescue in a pool so that they don't drown.
Yeah.
We teach them before they fall in the pool, not after. Okay.
Yeah.
So when we teach children about sexual abuse now, We don't tell them horrifying details about sexual crimes. We say simple things like, don't touch where my bathing suit covers. So there are ways to present this safety information to children that can be done by anyone.
Yeah.
There's ways to adjust the communication. But see, we have to begin by understanding that the way that churches have been communicating this has not been correct. And so when I say that, immediately I feel everybody pulling back like, oh no, we can't face it. But
What
listen,
do you
as
mean?
we
Yeah.
go forward, what I want to tell everybody is that when we move into the next step, what I'm saying, nobody knew.
Mm-hmm.
The child protection experts didn't know. I've been arguing with the secular experts about the exact same thing for the last 20 years. And before it was me, it was other people for 20 years. Because the type of victim that I'm talking about, they're not the most common. It's an extraordinarily rare subset of victims, but they happen to be concentrated inside of communities where they're able to isolate their victims, not in a shed or a closet or a basement, but inside of a community where the shared concepts about discipline and respect and obedience and corporal punishment make it impossible for the victims to figure out that they're being abused.
Right.
And so when we're talking,
That's
right.
exactly right. That's
So
exactly right,
when we're
Nolan.
talking about we've been having these conversations and I see people talking past each other. And the reason is that they have the wrong perspective. The survivor's perspective is the perspective of children who are hearing sermons and reading books and hearing articles and seeing adult conversations at unguarded moments, that when adults consider these conversations, they think of only adults hearing them. But if you're a child that's being abused through corporal punishment, your attention is so focused on that subject matter. It's the most significant thing that's going on in your life at that moment.
Can you give an example of like what one of those conversations might be, or what a typical like verse or sermon or phraseology that you would probably often hear adults say that in their conversation on their level, they're thinking there's nothing wrong with saying this, even if the kids are here, but they're seeing it a totally different way?
Well, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you guys just a short passage from a parenting book.
Okay.
And the reason why I want to do that is that I want to say right now that I know that a lot of mainline Protestants, if you're Catholic or you're Lutheran, you're Methodist, you may not know any of what I'm talking about. It may sound insane to you, but please still listen to what I'm saying because it goes out in your name.
Mm-hmm.
When this is so culturally normative, it goes beyond just teaching about spanking or corporal punishment, or if you use their hand or you use a stick or a paddle. It goes to the core concepts of adults being in an elevated position of authority over children and children being in a subordinate position. So even if the way that's expressed in your home is only by yes ma'am and no sir, these type of concepts, it's endorsed in a way. So as we go forward and you understand that what we're talking about is a person who is intrinsically motivated to abuse children because of a pathological emotional need, who is using things that you are saying, intentionally twisting them to deceive their victims in order to cause victims to normalize punishments that are extreme and bizarre. And so being on guard against this requires really understanding the mind of the offender, because the ways that they might twist another adult and turn you into a accomplice in grooming a victim to believe that they're experiencing something that's normal are myriad. They're endless. So I can't sit and make a list of them. But what I can tell you is that once you're attuned to the fact that there are adults in the world who are not abusing children because they have a motivation to change the child's behavior, rightly or wrongly. They're finding reasons to punish their children because they are gratified in some way by inflicting torment on another person.
Right.
And so if you don't have that understanding that the motive of this person is they are a sadistic personality, and their motives are like a pedophile. They're sneaky, they're conniving, they will spend years to worm their way into a family so that they can get access to victims or to gain access to victims through their employment by working as head of a school or some, summer camp or something where they have access to discipline other people's children. And my blog, I've shared the link with you. I know you're going to put it up for everybody, has lists of hundreds of cases of headmasters.
Is it the Facebook one? The Facebook
it's on
one?
Facebook. It's
Yep.
1320.
It should be in the description of the broadcast, and it'll be on the website too. So
it's 1324 is over here over this shoulder. And when you go there, there's hundreds of news stories that I've collected. So when you see what I'm saying, I know it's tough to accept. What I think about as I say that is when the Catholic sex abuse scandals first came forward, when people were told that a priest molested a kid, it just sounded unbelievable. It was so horrifying.
That's not what a priest is, right?
Like these guys are celibate. They don't even have sex. So like the concept. And then, for years, it was put forward that, it was the problem that the church didn't let the men have sex with anybody. And so that's why they do this. And, the belief that they could be
it away, and
the belief that they could be counseled and returned and so forth. So what you got to understand is that when you're dealing with cases of physical child abuse, the most important significant thing that's been published is the battered child syndrome. It was published in 1962. And this basically took things that were learned about battered women and extended it into the realm of children. Understanding that prior to this, if you beat up your kid, it was considered kind of like a bar brawl. It was just the same as if you punched an adult, right? But with battered child syndrome, we begin to understand these victims are a unique kind of vulnerable, and they're developmentally being injured by the conduct. And so this medical definition, the psychiatric definition, and the legal definition becomes the basis for understanding all of what everybody knows. And when I say everybody, I mean your pastor, I mean all of the child protection workers, many professors and people that I'll speak to. This is all that they basically have. This is the basis for how they understand physical child abuse. So just to run down, battered child syndrome, what you see is the abuses of impulsive. So it's motivated by anger. The perpetrator usually expresses remorse afterwards, whether he's sincere or not. He says that he feels bad. It reflects an inappropriate response to typical parenting stress. So when you have the parent who's overworked, or the single mom, or the parent who's struggling with addiction or poverty or issues like that, where service and support could help them, that's that type of offender. It's often comorbid with domestic violence. So you may see a guy who is abusing children to control the mother. Okay. Then you have the typical domestic violence cycle, which is you have the tension is building, and then there's some explosive event, and then there's what they call the honeymoon or the romance cycle. So this is kind of the typical setup of how people...
I mean, it is cyclical too. Like there's elements of I can't do it, whatever, and then trying to somehow gain trust of them again and come back around to it.
The issue with this paradigm is that if you have a parent that's involved in something like that, in some cases they could be counseled, they could be rehabilitated. A parent who's overstressed or overworked or experiencing poverty or just needs help and training, they could be helped in some way. But in the case of a parent who is abusing his children to control his wife, he's probably too much of a sociopath to be helped by counseling. But the thing is that when someone is an offender who is actually sadistic, who abuses for pleasure, they don't go through those cycles. They don't experience remorse about what they're doing. They don't have enough insight into what they're involved in to even go through. So when we're talking about intrafamilial child torture was first introduced into the medical literature in 2014. So in terms of research, this is basically brand new. Since it came out, there's been one additional study on intrafamilial child torture was published in 2021, and there's about 7 more that are planned over the next 2 to 3 years.
Really?
But this
that much attention. Okay.
Well, so what I want people to understand is that from this, I could make 5 4-hour presentations about how important this is.
Yeah.
But we're going to narrow it down, and we're going to just focus on this one area because it's important to me. So what you're looking at is that with intrafamilial child torture, no, when we get into talking about my case, my mom went to her pastor knowing that there was something wrong with the family and knowing that we needed help. So when she goes to the pastor as the authority, ideally he's more knowledgeable about this than she is. And so, for example, he would say, well, clearly you're involved in domestic violence. Your husband needs to get this intervention and you need to have that intervention. And then he helps the victim to know what her situation is. Well, the trouble is that for a long time, the concept of intrafamilial child torture just didn't exist. Nobody had it. And so the pastor that my mother went to couldn't have known. He couldn't have known how to counsel her. But the trouble is that because he's relying on the Bible as his counseling method, and also that mixed with a lot of tradition, just teachings that he inherited from other preachers, he is presenting his ignorance as if it was an absolute fact. And furthermore, showing a level of commitment to it, which would be admirable, except that in this case, as the family's deteriorating and getting worse and worse, instead of backing away from his position, he's doubling down again and again. So what I want to do,
and there's as someone who's worked on staff and been a pastor and been a part of that culture and community on the other side of that situation, man, there is a lot of pride, I think, that exists in the minds and hearts of a lot of pastors that they struggle with, like legitimately struggle with. And we've had conversations on this channel with other pastors about this complex on some level of being the person that's in charge of a congregation and leading all of these people, and the pressure that exists to feel like you have to be the guy that has it all together. And you have to be the one that has all the answers. And if you don't, that then starts to bring into question some level of credibility with people in your own congregation, or with whether or not people are going to follow you and listen to you and follow anything that you say. And so the idea of presenting this whole, like, I don't know. This is what the Bible says. This is what you should do,
Yeah, good leadership is, a lot of it is a matter of just presentation. And so for sure, it would be hard to be leading a congregation while appearing to not know what you're talking about.
True.
So
but there's a level of approachability that should be there for a pastor. And if they genuinely know that they're approaching and dealing with something that's out of their depth.
At this point, what we got to understand, though, is at this point, I'm going to present that there's enough evidence to just stop and say, okay, we made an error and let's start over and let's don't do it anymore. And arguing at this point, the only thing that's going to happen is that as time goes on, the truth is like a dead fish in the wall. It just gets more and more obvious. Yeah. And so what I want to say, though, is that I'm at a very optimistic point in my career, because after 20 years of working on this, in 2014, someone finally published in a peer-reviewed journal something that confirms everything that I've been saying, that opens a doorway medically and legally and through the psychiatric community for everything that I have been saying to come forward into the public awareness, so that the victims that are like me are not going to be locked out anymore.
That's awesome.
And I want for everybody to keep, as we're going forward, please have an optimistic perspective about what I'm saying. This is hard stuff to listen to, but at the same time, children are so much safer from sexual abuse today because of the lawsuits and the scandals, and because of the changes that have been implemented because of that. What I see in the newspaper now is that a youth minister was arrested for grooming a girl by giving her a cell phone.
Right.
And that means that he never got the chance to have sex with her. And so this is what we're saying, is that the Christian community, in terms of looking at perspective, understand that to people outside the Christian community, I do not spank my daughter. I don't ever use physical punishment. I don't even use star charts or stuff like that. We'll talk more about that. But the thing is that to me, if you banned spanking and made it a felony crime to do that tomorrow, it wouldn't affect my parenting, and I would never fear for me being arrested or charged, because my daughter is not going to say that I've struck her. I've never struck her.
Yeah.
So when you think of,
I mean, same with me, although I know there are people that I know within the church community
and
who
I'm not
still do. And
I'm not going to say that everybody who has ever, smacked their child's hand or whatever is a bad parent. I'm not going to do that. But what I will say is that if the way that people are getting away with abusing their kids is that they're claiming a defense under the corporal punishment exemptions in the law.
Yeah.
And at this point, the entirety of the child expert community is opposed to corporal punishment, except for the religious community. And so when we don't have anyone on the other side saying, yeah, we want to continue to have this, what I'm saying is that the Christian community is responsible for policing this.
Yeah.
Because it's something that they are asking for it to be legal. They're the ones requiring for this to be in the law. I don't need it. And so then when you realize that,
from the Christian perspective here, and not to cut you off, Dolan, but
go ahead. Please do.
Here's the deal. I have taken the position, and I know I'm going to piss off a lot of my Christian brothers and sisters saying this, but if you are resorting to physical violence in order to be able to discipline a child, I know the whole spare the rod, spoil the child, yada, yada, yada. The rod doesn't have to be a physical stick. Like, if you are resorting to physical abuse in any way, or I mean, just abuse, period, to be able to parent, prove that you're smarter than your kid, prove and demonstrate a level of emotional maturity, a level of what's the right word? Maturity. I mean, intelligent. Like, if you have to resort to physical abuse and physical violence in order to be able to get your point across when you're trying to discipline your child, you are literally taking a 2-year-old tantrum approach to discipline. Come on, be better.
I think that I have talked to so many people, and really, honestly, what I think is, it's important to recenter the conversation, that it's not really a debate about who is hitting their kids for disciplinary purposes, and that what I want to focus on is a particular narrow group of kids that never gets talked about.
Okay.
It's so important that we talk about them because they never get talked about. There's hundreds of people advocating against spanking and in favor of spanking, and everyone argues.
Debate, yeah.
And I please, for the love of God, can we not? Because this is the thing, is that the group of people that I'm talking about in particular are kids who are victims of the most severe kinds of abuse. So let's listen. Imagine what it does to a child's self-worth to be unable to avoid being spanked no matter how hard he tries, because his father creates rules that no child can follow in order to have reasons to whip him, because he gets sexually aroused by spanking and then goes to a private place to masturbate while thinking about it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that is different. And that is important to acknowledge.
It's really important to understand. My father was a sadist. He whipped his children for the pleasure that he got from hearing us screaming and crying and begging for mercy and pleading to God. He was not interested in correcting our behavior. He was interested in torturing us. And so by the time that I was 3 and my older brother was 7, my mother knew that there was something very, very wrong about what was going on. Mm-hmm. And so when she asked him, what are you doing to our children? And he says, I am disciplining them. And she said, where in the world? She was raised Catholic. She was raised on a farm. She did not have an easy childhood by any means, and suffered many forms of abuse. But when she saw this, it was beyond the pale to her. I remember one of my uncles saying that he would go around with infected sores. His dad would go around with infected sores on his hand from cuts on his hands from his children's teeth from punching them. Mm-hmm. And then my mom is seeing the way that our father is treating us, and she says, this is not right. So she says to him, where did you learn this? And he says, I learned it at the Baptist church. And she says, I know that's a lie. This is ridiculous. There's no possible way that any preacher is in favor of this. And so she went to the nearest Baptist church, literally, just drove to the nearest place, walked in the door. It happened to be a landmark Baptist church. So the main thing about landmarkism, it's this very small group of churches that broke away from the main Baptist church. And essentially they believe that all of the other denominations have got something so drastically wrong in what they're teaching that everyone who goes to that church is going to hell. So once they walked into this church, the immediate message is God brought you to this place. And so you were brought here for a reason. If you leave from here, then you have left from God's plan and you will be forever wandering. You will never get back to where you were supposed to be. And so my mother was very young. She was in her 20s, which to me, I'm a 45-year-old father of a 10-year-old. So when I think about my mom at her age and with the problems that she was having, you know, she was being beaten by her husband in order to control her and maintain access to have children for him to abuse. He's controlling her. And so, you know, I want to really emphasize to people, it is very difficult to know in your own heart that you are being abused. To tell yourself, I am being abused, is hard. And it is really hard to say to yourself, my child has been abused.
Yeah.
My child is being abused. It's hard to say to yourself.
To say it to you, and then I'll open up and say it to other people.
That's correct. That
can
really
become like a self-shaming thing on some level as a parent.
Listen to me. Listen to me. When you then, the next step after you say it to yourself is you have to then make the resolve to go and seek help from an outside authority. And so when I'm telling you that my mother already knew that we were in jeopardy, that our lives were in danger, and then she went to the church. And the church is the most common place that people go when there's a mental health crisis or some kind of a problem. It's the first place that a lot of people will go because they're afraid of law enforcement. They're afraid of child protective services taking their kids away from them. They're trying to do it themselves so that they can fix this problem easily before it becomes widely known that they're struggling with an issue. And so when my mom went into the church, she's relying on this person that's presented himself as an expert. And she's presenting to him the evidence that she has in the limited way that she's able to understand with her knowledge, which is, you know, understandably is flawed, and also is, I'm sure she was not completely forthright in presenting all of the details. But the thing is that the reaction that came from the church was that she should be more submissive, first of all. And then secondly, that she needed to teach her children to behave in such a way that there wouldn't be a cause for their father to need to discipline them.
Did they go to him at all and talk to him about that you know of?
Absolutely. My parents had regular marital counseling with this guy. Okay. So you understand that my mom is not going to the church as a member, just attending and sitting in the pew. That they've joined the church as a family in crisis, and very soon after they've come, they've approached the pastor to be in counseling about these issues.
Okay.
And so,
well, and here's the interesting thing that I learned. I mean, I have a master's in ministry. I got a master's degree from Olivet Nazarene University down in Bourbonnais, Illinois, and to some degree, to reflect on the fact that of how much more aware I think pastors are being taught and trained on how to handle stuff like this, and improvement that has been happening from in what you're talking about. When I specifically went through several different courses on pastoral ministry, one thing specifically that kept getting pounded in us was, you are not a professional counselor. You're not a counselor. You may be a spiritual guide. You may be someone who can provide, you know, biblical insight and wisdom and stuff like that to help people. But if you want to go into the field of psychologically and therapy and counseling and providing marital counseling or all of that sort of stuff, then pursue that field. You're not trained to be able to do counseling and therapy. That's not what your job is, and you need to know where that line is, because otherwise you're going to be opening up the door for all kinds of problems that you're not prepared for professionally, as well as bringing all kinds of potential extremely damaging and troublesome advice to people who need significantly more than you're qualified to offer. So that was encouraging to me and clarifying when I was going through it. But I can't imagine but thinking that the pastor that your mom and dad was going to, I mean, he probably thought, yeah, I'm here to counsel. That's part of my job.
Well, the thing is, you're 100% correct. And it's important for people to focus on really what you said is the church has already changed. Yeah. So the first excuse for not changing is we've always been this way. But the truth is the church has realized that a lot of things that they've taught have been incorrect. A good example of that is that it used to be really regarded that teaching children nothing about sex, not the names of their body parts or their functions, not don't tell them that the possibility that they might experience someone attempting to sexually assault them. There was a long process to get churches and other traditional communities to accept that was actually making children less safe. That and as far as not being a good thing to do, it wasn't just not good, it was actually the opposite of good, it was bad. Mm-hmm. And so that as we have accepted the necessity of giving information, honest, factual information about their bodies and the names that's age appropriate at the right time, gives kids the right information that they can understand when something makes them uncomfortable and react to it before it progresses into something worse. Understand that when something is not right at home, that other adults are available to protect them and how to access that. So, dealing with domestic violence, churches have made leaps and bounds in understanding it. Churches have made leaps and bounds in dealing with sexual abuse. So the thing is that while we're making leaps and bounds in dealing with these very common, the most common types of presentation are important to deal with first, because that's the huge number of victims. Victims of intrafamilial child torture are the smallest number of victims, but on the other hand, they're very, very important because these are the kids who experience the most severe, long-term, fatal abuse. And 100% of children who experience this form of abuse are going to have permanent psychological and emotional injuries. They're going to have significant lifelong problems from this. And a big part of those significant lifelong problems is not because of the conduct of the adults towards them. It's because of the response of the community and the way that the community unwittingly becomes a participant in this through the manipulations of these offenders who are very conniving. And so we have now understood that there was a time when people would just be stunned if you said that a man who had been a head of a school for 25 years was molesting children. They would say, well, that's crazy. That man loves children. His whole life is dedicated to children. Why would he harm them? Right. And now when I say it, it sounds naive. People would laugh. But you see, that's the level of naivety that we're at when it comes to parents who have sadistic impulses to abuse children physically, to do extreme humiliation, to do terrorization. These are things that are beyond unthinkable. And that's what it used to be with sexual abuse as well, is that it was beyond unthinkable. People couldn't conceive of it. And so what happens is that because the adult is overwhelmed by the mere magnitude of the horror of this crime, the majority of victims, they're not invisible and locked away. They're actually out in public walking around. And on average, victims of torture, in the most commonly cited study was done by Knox, they were seen by CPS between 1 and 15 times before they were either killed. Up to a third of them were killed by the abuse. And among the remainders, they were seen over and over and over again for child abuse. They're reporting they were seen by medical doctors. They were noted that they were in bad condition, but what happened was that the caregiver's explanation was believed, and the child wasn't even asked.
So how that's startling. That is upsetting statistics. It is not to jump too far ahead here, but how do Christians make sure that sort of thing doesn't take forever for the right thing to happen, or for it to end tragically only because the victim ends up dying? Like,
Well, this
how do you
is
start
what you
that, you
have.
know?
It really, this is the thing that you have to understand is the where the failure is that because we all know the basic model is that the guy is an explosive batterer and he goes through this cycle of the honeymoon and the building tension and the explosive event, and the guy is angry. He's an angry guy who can't control himself. We're not on guard for the person who he really is, which is he's cold and calculated and he's conniving. He's wormed his way into a family to get access to children. And now what he's done is he's attached my father intentionally gave my mom the suggestion to go over to the local Baptist church, not to any old church, but to a Baptist church. And the reason is that he knows when he gets there, the type of culture that he's going to find. So where everyone now is pulling away from me, come back. Because what I'm telling you is that it's not that the pastor is there trying to exhort everyone in the audience to abuse their children.
Right.
It's not that. What's happening is that this person who is sadistic is going to present to his victims like a little play, a little show. And he sets the stage and he sets on there the players, which are other adults that he has recruited to help him to put on a little show for this victim. And what his show is to do is to convince the child that what is being done to me at home is normal. And so when we are not,
it's
when
straight
we're not
up gaslighting, like that's
right,
that's
so
exactly what it is. Yeah.
Right. So think about this: is a pedophile will leave a pornographic magazine in a place where a child is certain to find it as a method of grooming the child to initiate sexual contact. It's very commonly known. Okay. Yeah. Well, what happens is that my father is obtaining at the church a Christian parenting manual. It's a book about how to beat your kid. Or no, I mean, how to spank your kid biblically. So, right. But the thing is
but
that,
I mean, how is the kid going to be interpreting that?
Listen, when I'm reading John Roseman's book from 2021, what he says at least 3 different times is that the wrong kind of person.
2021.
It's this book. I'm reviewing his most recent release. And what he's saying is the wrong kind of person won't be reading my book. I can say these things because I don't have to worry about child abusers reading this. But let me tell you something.
That is such an ignorant position.
It is
no control over that too. So that's ridiculous.
It is and it isn't. And I'll tell you why. Is that where he's correct is that nobody who tortures their own kid is at all interested in improving their parenting.
That's very
100% of people who study this and are experts on it agree that they cannot be rehabilitated. Or if they can be, not in any kind of time frame that would let them resume taking care of a kid. So the thing is that when John Roseman is saying that the wrong person won't be reading the book, the reason they would be reading the book is that they've been compelled to read it by their spouse, like my father was brought into ministry. And so here's a person who the author of the book didn't intend it to be used as a manual for rehabilitating a sadistic child abuser who beats children for fun. Okay. But this winds up being how it's used because when mom brings this jerk into the church and introduces them to the pastor, no one in the room understands what they're dealing with. They don't know that this guy is basically, he's exactly like a domestic violence offender who goes into marriage counseling. Is on the one hand, the counselor is an authority to the female, but he's not any kind of authority to the abuser. The abuser doesn't respect him at all. So the abuser is never going to be controlled by anything that this counselor says. My father was not going to be controlled by anything that this man told him. He had no motive or interest in following any of it whatsoever. His only reason in being in the counseling session at all is that he's manipulating the pastor to control my mother to continue to have access to a victim. Is that if my mother left, which is what she was about to do, and what she did eventually do, when she escaped from the influence of the church and she got into domestic violence counseling with people who knew what they were talking about, she understood that what she needed to do was flee. Okay. But in listening to the pastor, his belief is that someone who's abusing children wouldn't show up in counseling, but they very frequently do. They show up because they're court ordered. They show up there reading that book because they are there because their spouse or their family members have forced them. But here's what I want you to understand is when you send a Christian parenting book home with a sadistic child abuser, what he's going to do is leave it lay around the house, because when the kids pick it up and read it, they're flipping through this book trying to see a description of the child abuse that they're experiencing. They're wondering whether they are being abused. When I was a kid, there was an episode of The Incredible Hulk. This is the old show with Lou Ferrigno and green.
I was going to say Lou Ferrigno, and he had the makeup and everything.
Okay, so in this episode, there's a guy who's beating his kid with a belt, and it was so horrifying to me. It was like literally my worst nightmare. I mean, I'll still stand out in the sweat just thinking about this image. And then the Incredible Hulk bursts in through the door and beats the shit out of the dad. I mean,
yeah.
So like this story, I became so obsessed with this story that literally every day at lunch, any kid that I could get to play with me, all we were doing is reenacting the scene over and over again of the Incredible Hulk coming to rescue me from my dad.
Yeah.
So you understand that when a book comes into the house and it's about discipline and it's about punishment and it's about what God wants, this was not something that I was disinterested in. This was the central core facet of my life. The most important thing that I was going through at that moment was the center of this book.
Yeah.
And what they do is they put it in the bathroom so I can read it all the time.
How old were you?
I would have been in first grade.
Okay.
So between first grade and I was between the ages of 3 and 9. So between first and third grade, this would have been going on. So when you realize that the messages that come from these books about how to deal with child abuse are assuming that the offender feels bad about abusing the kid and is interested in becoming a better parent. So here's what I'm going to tell you. This will make the rest of this much easier to understand. This will be a little hard to hear. So the pastor is telling my mom that the reason why we're screaming and begging and pleading is because she keeps coming to the rescue. So what she needs to do is when we're getting whipped, she should go to the other end of the house to put her fingers in her ears so that she can't hear us screaming. And that if she does this, we will learn that no one is going to come to our rescue, and then we will quiet down.
Wow.
So she is following this advice. And of course, what's happening is that these whippings are becoming worse and worse. And so,
like literally the opposite of what should have been done. And that's,
well, you know, the thing is that this pastor is just believing. The father comes in and he sounds so reasonable.
Right.
Okay. He's explaining that he's just trying to discipline his kids and they've done something that's wrong and his wife is overreacting and he sounds like the reasonable one. And so she comes across as just being a flighty woman who has a big heart and she just can't stand for these kids to suffer anything at all. Well,
the dad's just more equipped to be the disciplinarian, so let him do his job, kind of a thing. And like that's an example right there of why pastors are not counselors. Like but anyways.
So he's telling her to stay out of the way, and he's counseling my brother and I about how to endure the discipline. Okay, so
how to endure it.
Right.
So not even necessarily how to.
Well, you understand that
coming upon you, but
it's being presented that we are misbehaving by screaming and crying and being very demonstrative during being punished.
So being kids,
right? Well, the point though is that it never dawns on the pastor to consider that we're being tortured.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. His immediate assumption is that if children are screaming and acting insane during a punishment, means that the child is overly dramatic. The parent must be being reasonable, even though the mother is present and saying that it's unreasonable. He's believing that he's taking the father's word for it and deciding that this is reasonable.
Yeah.
So listen, this is the thing is he says you have to make the kids behave so well that there wouldn't be any reason. So what she does is she quits her job at the bank and she goes to work waiting tables at the diner. And she's going to work on the graveyard shift overnight. So in the afternoon, when we get home from school, our mother is at home and she feeds us and bathes us and puts us in bed. And we're asleep for hours when she leaves to go to work. When she gets out of the house, Dad comes and drags one or the other of us out of bed by our leg and he's whipping us. And his order of business is that he wants for me to tell him what my brother did that is worthy of a whipping. So between going back, this is what you have to understand, is that nothing that this pastor is doing is on track at all, because he can't fathom that this guy was left in charge of unconscious sleeping children. There was no possibility that we had done something to cause him to want to react. We were not even, we were unconscious.
You were asleep and hoping to rest through the night.
Right. And so, now here's the thing though, is that what he's done is he's put in a house. When the pastor's assumption is that the parent is angry and motivated by parental frustration, this child won't behave. Okay, understand, my dad wasn't frustrated with us. We weren't in the room. He was waiting for his wife to leave so that he could create a reason. What he's doing by whipping me and making me accuse my brother is now my brother is blaming me for him getting whipped instead of blaming our father. He's got me blaming my brother because he accused me of something. And I mean, it's round and round. Now the pastor has given this guy a list. The intention of the list of things, you're supposed to tell the kid the rules, and then you make them go to the room while you calm down, and then you go in and you read them the Bible, and you make them confess to what they did wrong, and then you give them their spanking, and if they don't cry for too long, then it's over, and you give them a hug, okay? All of these things, really what it boils down to is the pastor is believing that this person is emotionally at a heightened level. And these are little speed bumps that are supposed to drag out the process of arriving at the corporal punishment. This allows the parent time to get calm or to reconsider. Okay. Well, in the case of someone who is deriving emotional gratification from punishing their kid, it really functions more like foreplay. It just ramps up their excitement.
Yeah,
there is not, the list of things does not slow them down. It doesn't discourage them from doing the abuse at all. So what's happening instead is that, again, the sole purpose of engaging in this conduct is that this conduct convinces the child who has seen this book and heard this sermon from the pastor and been given these instructions. The child is now convinced that because the father followed this list of instructions, anything that now follows constitutes a reasonable corporal punishment.
That is justified.
Right. So this is the thing, is that while children have substantial rights and everyone recognizes them, we generally kind of think of these rights as belonging to children who are abused, but not necessarily like to my kid. Okay. So children who are abused don't know that they're abused. They believe, they have been led to believe through a series of little illusions. They've been walked through scene after scene. It could be strangers in the grocery store, and this parent walks up to them to announce that he spanked his kid in the parking lot because he wants to give them the opportunity to tell this victim, yeah, that's great. It's wonderful when your parents spank you. So when you're saying what are the kinds of things that people do and say, is these are the kinds of things that people do and say, is that when you endorse corporal punishment and you don't really know what the other person is calling corporal punishment, it's like there's a story where the man is molesting his daughter, and when he molests her, he says, this is how you love your dad.
Right.
And then she goes to school and she says to her friends, do you love your dad? And they say, yeah, I love my dad.
And they automatically associate that.
So here you have. Now, so here's the thing, is when we say that a pedophile would leave pornography around your house as a means of grooming children. Well, when a person is interested in beating children for pleasure, whether they are sexually aroused by it or whether it serves an emotional need to feel powerful and in control, or they are reenacting abuse from their own childhood and they need a victim as a stand-in, whatever their purpose of what they're doing, when that's what their heart is for, that person is not open to, they're not open to hearing about rehabilitation. They're only there, they're completely selfishly motivated. And so to have pastors and ministries coming in, it's actually for them, for that person to be mistaken for an average domestic violence batterer would be actually even still a benefit to them. In other words, they're even worse than that. If they're mistaken for a domestic violence offender or a parent who's frustrated, they would be offering them the opportunity to go through rehabilitation. So this is a good opportunity to look a little bit at the legal framework that governs. Yeah. So I'm going to take.
Before we
Go
transition to
ahead.
that real quick, I want to just throw out to everybody watching live, if you're resonating with any of this, or if you have questions that you want to ask Dolan, go ahead and put them down in the chat. We're going to try and set aside a little bit of time once we're done going through the content and the story that Dolan's wanting to share with everybody. Give it an opportunity to do a question and answer. And if there's anything at all about what he's sharing that resonates with you personally, or with a situation that you are personally connected with or privy to, we will definitely be making sure there's stuff in the description and providing some resources to be able to help get you the support that you need to. But speaking of support, though, like the legal process, like you were saying, Dolan, what does that look like? Because I know we said you had mentioned earlier, oftentimes people end up going through DCFS and like all this crazy stuff, and it ends up not really.
Well, this is, again, this will go to perspective. To understand the perspective of survivors of this type of torture, the first thing that you want to think about is that, for me, when I look back on it, the church and the church community is really the biggest and most significant factor, because without them, my mother tried by every avenue and means until she finally did escape. So our visit of going to the Baptist church and through it was simply a detour of wasted time that prevented us from being rescued, that enabled further abuse and worsened our situation in every possible way. So had we just simply never have heard of the church, we would have been far better off, because wherever she went, she would have been better. When eventually, she did leave, and we did wind up into a domestic violence shelter, and she did get counseling that eventually helped us to escape. So going back to talk about the legal framework, what you want to understand about physical abuse versus sexual abuse is, when you talk about sexual abuse, the laws are very, very, very specific. They say the ages of the victims and the body parts that are involved and the relationships between these people, and whether this was one time or a course of conduct. And like in Florida, it goes all the way down to the slightest, it says in the law, the slightest penetration is the difference between rape and fondling. And so now when you move over and you look at the physical abuse laws, well, the physical abuse laws, they do have some specifics and some things that they'll point out that you're not supposed to do. But the problem is, you have a reasonable corporal punishment exemption. That means that there's an automatic presumption that you are not guilty of child abuse if you if you just make the claim that you were spanking your kid for disciplinary reasons. So the first thing that you have to understand about this is that the reasonable standard is not defined in the law. So what that means is that in order to exercise the reasonable standard, it must go before a jury. So if you imagine how many instances of physical child abuse there are, and the fact that each and every one of them, in order to prosecute the parent, has to go in front of a jury to be adjudicated. Wow. Okay. So now when you are also considering this, if you're a prosecutor, prosecutors, when they run for office, they're looking to have a case conviction rate in the 99 point something range. So the way they do that is they plead out almost every single case, and they only go to court with cases that they know that they can win. So when you're looking at a physical abuse case and there's an accusation where the parent claims corporal punishment, this is going to go to a jury, because no lawyer in their right mind would tell the parent to do anything but go to a jury. And the reason is that when you hear that a jury is hearing these physical abuse cases and ruling on what's reasonable or not, it might feel like on first glance that what's going to happen is they're going to average together kind of the way that all 12 of these jurors look at this, and then they're going to decide, and these kids would get the amount of protection that the average child in the community gets based on these 12 people. But in reality, only one juror is required to acquit. Really? So it means that the case isn't decided by averaging together 12 different people's opinion about that spanking. 11 of them could have seen a hideous act of child abuse. And if one of them, looks at it and says, yeah, it looks okay to me. It's in a gray area. I don't know if it's abuse. My dad probably did something like that to me. That one juror is the one that sends the child home with that person. So recently there was a case in Georgia where the prosecutor allowed the offender, he was a child abuse offender, the prosecutor allowed him to plead in exchange for probation. And when he came home, the son shot him in the head with a gun, murdered him on the front porch. And when it went to the grand jury said there was no bill to charge him because the abuse was so severe that the child was warranted to murder his father.
Wow.
But the prosecutor in the county thought he should get probation. So you see that shows you that if people are listening to me, understand that what you think is the rules and what you think goes on is not what goes on. Yeah. They get away with anything until the kid is dead or so physically, bodily injured that they appear like a corpse.
Yeah.
It won't even go in front of a jury, because if there's one person on the jury that sees that and says, yeah, it looks like a gray area, then the kid goes home.
Then that's it.
So, right. So now the thing that you have to understand with victims of torture is, let's go back to the little boy whose father masturbates after he whips him. This man does not need to beat the child bloody. He gets gratified by a plain old over-the-knee spanking with his hand or a ping pong paddle. We recently, you could go through the blog for my book, we recently broke up a Facebook group that was organizing an in-person conference for parents to come and go through this and do spanking demonstrations on live children in front of other people.
Really?
This is a group of people that are meeting to exchange photos and videos and audio recordings of children being spanked. And these children believe that they are receiving disciplinary corporal punishment. They have no way whatsoever.
Was this group done and organized by Christians, or was it like, no, we're going to use the video and the...
Obviously what they do is, these people are all... They're not Christians.
They're religious people.
No. These are pedophiles who are sexually gratified by the thought of doing this. And so what they're doing is they are using the corporal punishment exemptions to create groups. One of these guys actually created an activism group in Canada that was in favor of spanking. Wow. And he wound up under investigation. He had a son that he'd adopted. I don't have all of the facts about it, but this is what you have to understand, is that when people, where we are now with pedophilia is that when I tell you that some guy spent 10 years working his way into a position to molest children at a school, that sounds credible to you.
Right.
And so if you are someone like me, you realize all of these offenders, the reason why they're in the Christian community is that there's not spanking outside of it.
Right.
And Christians are so unaware of how unpopular spanking is. Less than 19% of current parents of children ages 2 to 12 are in favor of spanking.
Yeah.
So because
I just point out, like, this is something that after working in the church for the length of time that I did, and being privy to a lot of this sort of stuff happening, and then coming out of it and recognizing, like, people who are wired the way that Dolan is talking about look at Christianity, they look at the faith community, they look at the message of forgiveness, they look at the message of redemption, they look at the hopeful component of the gospel message, right? They look at that as a prime opportunity for them to be able to I just lost Dolan. We'll get him back. They look at it as a prime opportunity for them to be able to continue abusing and having people continue to be forgiving, and for them to be forgivable. And, like, there's a redemptive component to it that attracts that type of individual to then use it to their advantage and continue their abusive behavior within that community. I've seen it. It definitely attracts those individuals, which is why I think so many Christians, so much of the church is waking up to that that fact, hopefully. And we're seeing churches and church leadership change and training them on how to recognize these things and do better. But we got a lot of progress to make. And I'd argue that it needs to be more than just the church leadership and staff that needs to be trained and taught how to handle these things. So I lost Dolan for some reason. I don't know. His connection dropped here for a second. We'll see if he gets back. Hopefully he does and he can come back. Live broadcast, right? Some of the stuff that's out there, I'll just take a minute. Secular Thinker is chiming in, and putting out a plug out there for the Recovering from Religion. I know I threw this up there a second ago. This is an organization I know for Ethan Michael, if you remember him from the Friendly Neighborhood Atheist podcast. I was able to go on his 1-year anniversary stream. That was a fundraiser, actually, for Recovering from Religion. I wasn't the only Christian in the broadcast, which was really awesome. And the reason why I was so in favor of going on and supporting it was because they're doing good work in supporting people who are victims of abuse and trauma at the hands of people who are, religious and religious communities and leadership. And that's something that Christianity needs to recognize and own up to and do better. So he put the info out there. So thank you so much for doing that in the chat. He also mentioned, hey, I'm not trying to where was that comment? Yeah, he's like, it's not a propaganda thing, right? Don't worry, dude. I wouldn't throw it up there if I thought it wasn't worth sharing. So but if you are interested in getting connected with that community, if you've gone through a process of abuse and all of that stuff, and you're trying to get the help that you need, and you keep going to the church and they're not doing what they're supposed to, and getting you the support that you need. There's resources out there. I'm a huge advocate of doing what we can to get people the help that they need. Because God knows, like if you're experiencing abuse and trauma, to the point of literally being abused to the point of death or suicide or anything like that, like let's be honest, that's not what anyone wants. That's not what we want. And certainly not Christians. And if we're part of the problem, then we need to be willing to recognize that if we can't provide the help that someone needs, then we need to get it to them regardless. And if it's not from us, that needs to be okay. So I'm not sure where Dolan is. I'm wondering if we might need to do a part 1 and a part 2. If we can't get him back here, hopefully we can get him back. I wonder if his internet dropped or maybe his phone died or something. Let me see if there's a message from him, possibly. Did I get one from him? Yeah. Nope. I wonder if his connection dropped. So unfortunately, that means we aren't going to be able to get to the questions. We're approaching about an hour and a half here, which is when I was about to wrap up the conversation. So we might have to just break this up into a 2-parter, and that's okay. Thank you all for chiming in. If you do have a question, leave it in the comments. We may I'm sure we'll probably work out something to bring him back, and continue and wrap up this conversation and then answer your questions. Because is he back? He might be back.
I am back.
Hey, there he is.
I will have no video, but I am back.
It's all good, dude. No worries. You want no video? That's okay.
Well, that was great. Everybody, I'm sure, appreciated 4 minutes of not hearing me talk.
Hey, that's totally okay. I can BS my way through 4 minutes of talking. It's not a big deal.
No, you know, the phone was going dead, and I can't plug in headphones at the same time as the charger, and so that was
makes
all
sense,
of that.
dude. No worries. It's all good. I'm glad to have you back. Glad we can.
Yeah. So where I left off, we were talking about the jury system and all that. And so this is something where to recenter, I was telling you earlier that there are things that people can do themselves. Well, one of the things is that if juries were a little more sensitive about the needs of children who are victims of torture, then it would be easier for prosecutors to bring these cases and to get these children protection.
Yeah.
The other thing that is really important for people to realize is that the most common way that these children are getting left out of being protected is that they're getting actually screened out by the very first adult that talks to them. There is a mental map that we have that says that the child abuser is an angry, drunk person, or they're frustrated, or, you know, all the assumptions. Well, this predatory personality type presents like a pedophile does. They are sneaky and manipulative, and they have their act together. They love to go in front of any authority figure, because when they get called in front of an authority figure, they're going to twist that situation around to make it appear to the child that they have the upper hand. So what this means is that, from my perspective, I parent my child in a way where I don't accept a position of authority and obedience. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone should do this. That's not the point. What I'm saying is that in your own family, the rights and privileges and the situation and circumstances that you give to your own children, that you consider to be normal for the culture, because abused children don't know that they're abused, they assume that whatever standards apply to children generally will also apply to them in their particular situation. So what it means is that abused children are feeling tremendous pressure from adults to obey their abusers. They're feeling tremendous pressure from adults to not feel critical or not feel resentment or anger toward people who are abusing them.
Yeah.
And so all of the, you know, the exhortation to comply, to obey, to submit, all of that comes onto a child who is being abused as pressure from the adult community to comply with their abuser. And so understanding that in order for these children to be able to execute the rights that you think that they have, the only way that they can access those rights is that they must first have been declared to be the official victim of child abuse in some kind of investigation. You see, when we say that I don't want my child to have the right to refuse a request from me. Right. I only want for abused children to have the right to resist a legitimate request. I want my children to show this level of respect where they're you know, calling me ma'am and sir, and not meeting my eyes, and, you know, won't speak unless they're spoken to. When that's the standard of behavior that you think should apply in a classroom or in a Sunday school, okay, what you're doing is you're setting up a society where children are so diminished in their right to have space, to make noise, to be spoken to, and to be heard, that when children, it's fine for your kids. And this is the main thing, is that when you have a benevolent dictator, then the tyranny of this is okay. But the trouble is that if you support a society that supports benevolent dictators, then you support a society that supports dictators generally. Right. Because every privilege and right that you give to yourself, you are equally granting to everyone else. That's exactly it. To close the circle, look at what they do now in the Boy Scouts. No one-on-one contact between the men and the boys. You know how much great stuff probably happened in one-on-one contact between the scout leaders and the scouts? Okay, but the thing is that it also created this conflict, a problem where children were molested. Exactly. Okay, these guys, we can't have men sleeping in a tent with a kid. That's not allowed. They just don't allow it at all anymore. And you know what? Maybe some kids are scared and there's other issues that come up. I'm sure that it happens. But you see, when you look at the case of Jerry Sandusky. He ran a charity that helped a lot of kids to get into college, but every one of his victims he met through his charity. And so we don't then go and say that the charity did a lot of good, because the motive for running the charity was how he was meeting his victims. And so in the same way, the people who are pointing to the benefits that come from this type of parenting, which they, purport to go to the society.
Right.
First thing that you have to understand is that, to me, I have what I would consider to be really a perfect marriage, an ideal situation with my wife and me being in agreement about the way that we raise our kids. We're older parents, so we're more mature and we're well suited to each other. And, I have a 10-year-old kid that I just don't have any complaints about. She's a really good housemate, and, she's smart and she's funny. She's not like a soup kid or some kind of a nerd. She's got things that are weird about her, and we have issues like everybody does, but we're not having any problem as a result of, not being involved in the church.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that I spent years in therapy. I spent years and years in really good group therapy that helped and made me into a person that now, when I parent my kid, that's the pool of knowledge that I reach into.
Yeah.
And the thing is this is so important to understand, is that it works for us.
Yeah.
And so
it's promoting the well-being and mental health of your daughter, which should be significantly higher on the list of things that I think a lot of Christians value in the life of every person that they see.
Well, I think
and I feel like that's growing. I feel like it's growing, but
there's a feeling among, because people who are religious are constantly told that the problems in the world are with people who are moving away from religion. Well, I think that there is a lot of, to me, what you have to understand is that my way of parenting and approaching my family is based entirely on psychological principles and atheistic worldview that doesn't have anything to do with religion. Entirely everything that I experienced when I was involved in the church was negative and harmful to me. So, I don't have any relationship with my parents. I don't love my mom or my dad. I was never able to emotionally bond to either of those people because they were so dangerous for me. The things that I experienced were nightmarish.
Yeah, and understandably so.
And right, so
who would fault you for that, right?
You just have to understand that the presumption when we enter into conversation is that really deep down inside, I know that the church is right and that this is the good way of doing things. Right. And what I want to use
the church, because of course the way the church has always done things has always been the best way, right? I mean, it's just how we've always done it, and so that's how we're always going to do it. And if
it's the way that people view it. It's the way that people view it, and the reason is, for a long time, everybody raised their kids the same way, and particularly, during the 50s and 60s, it was a very conformist time when, because of the military draft, everybody was kind of on the same page. Everyone was going to graduate high school and go be a soldier. So everyone needed to be nice and obedient and very patriotic and, all of those types of things. So, I think it's important. As I say, I've spoken to a lot of older people that grew up in those generations when that was the norm, and most of them were not abused. But the thing about it is that within the society and the culture that you create, when you create a culture that normalizes automatic reverential respect for figures of authority and obedience to those authorities, it creates the opportunity for abuse, because all abuse is an abuse of authority. Yeah. So when you are unnaturally elevating authorities into positions where they have extreme power differentials with the people below them, those power differentials are so unsafe that, as nations, we did away with the role of king. We just did away with it because it could never be secured. Yeah. So when you realize that the basic difference between me as a non-authoritarian parent, the essence of non-authoritarian parenting is that I make predictions to my kid about what will happen if you do this or that. and then I get out of the way and I let her do the experiments to prove me right.
Right.
So if she's
It's a
jumping
learning
on
opportunity for her, and sometimes maybe a learning opportunity for you as a parent. So, I
right.
mean,
So, you know,
yeah,
there's the thing is, if I tell her, if you jump on the couch, you might fall down and get hurt. And she comes back and says, look, I've jumped on the couch and I didn't get hurt. I'm going to say, go ahead, keep trying. Okay. In a minute, you're going to find out. So
yeah,
you see that the thing about that form of parenting is that my consequences are so certain. They're natural consequences. If you don't brush your teeth, you're going to have to meet the dentist drill. And it
yeah,
doesn't matter if I
right.
catch you or I don't catch you. So, you know, the main thing, as I say, is you have to understand there's a widespread belief that people who have left the church have gone on to this bad path and that things are going to go wrong for them. But from my perspective, I have all friends who parent this way. My daughter goes to a private Montessori school, and it's all a child-centered way of rearing kids. She calls her teachers by their first name.
Mm,
She's been there since age 2, and she's 10. And, you know, she's a classically trained piano player and she reads on a ninth grade level. But, you know, she's also really down to earth. She runs a YouTube channel and she just likes to play and swing and run on and jump on her trampoline in the backyard.
mm,
But the thing is that the general appeal for me to return back to a Christian parenting paradigm, there's zero interest in that. There's no appeal in it. And what you have to see is that that is now the majority of parents in the United States are saying
mm,
that they don't consider a
right.
religious upbringing to be a significant factor in bringing up their kids. And so, listen, when you have less than 7% of children who are raised by parents who are raised non-religious are being taught anything about religion,
Mm,
meaning that the opportunity to recover people who have left from the church is vanishing by the time they have their children and raise them apart from the church. The chance
mm-hmm,
that the person in the third generation would return, you have a greater chance of starting smoking as an adult
right.
than for one of these
Yeah.
people to have their
And that,
child
and
grow
that
up and
just,
join a religion.
yeah. And that just, that right there, if anything else, for
If
those who are Christians who have a evangelistic sort of focus in the way that they're living their life. And they're like, well, I need to raise my children to, love and honor God and all of that stuff. You can really screw up that opportunity big time by tolerating or perpetuating an environment that allows abuse like this to thrive and shove people out of Christianity and the religion that you love so dearly, and they will never come back.
right,
And
and the thing
it's
is
a lot of that is the cause of it.
and it's not, and the thing is it's not that every Christian parent needs to change the whole way that they parent. They need to become conscious of, listen, when we have pornography, we don't allow pornography to be sold to children. And if we catch somebody showing pornography to children, then that's a problem right off the bat.
Right.
And so,
Exactly.
because we have made that the case in our society, it becomes that if a child is shown pornography, the child probably has some input from a parent or from a friend or family member, maybe from a peer, that something is off about that. Well, you see, a book about Christian parenting, there's no restrictions on where it can be shown. So
Mm,
when you understand that that book is being used just like pornography would be to groom children to suffer abuse, and that your articles, your poorly worded sermons, all of those communications that are created with no thought given. It's not that they're evil and bad and trying to tell people to kill their kid. The
but
problem
the
is it's
ignorance involved in it is
right. And
making it an opportunity for abusive people to take advantage of it and
so this
justify
is
their actions. Yeah.
what we call is manufacturing ignorance.
Yeah.
When actually what they're doing is, rather than trying to bring to the front the concerns of these victims so that they can receive help and have access to support that they need,
Yeah.
instead what they want to do is to conceal. They don't want people to talk about the fact that there are these wrong motives for spanking, because it's going to reflect negatively on the church and it's going to discredit their teachings. But you see, the thing that's most significant to me is my pastor, my ex-pastor, is one of my big supports in doing advocacy. But, you know, he's always concerned about my soul.
Mm,
And, you know, what I tell him is my mission is for millions of souls. Is
mm,
there are so many kids that are going through this abuse that have already been through it, and they're, you know, my daughter is a victim of the abuse that I suffered, and so is my wife. You
mm.
know, it affects me every day. I sleep 1 to 3 hours a night. It is the most significant thing. Every time that I open my eyes from sleeping, I'm picturing my trauma. I'm scanning the room to see if I'm going to be grabbed out of my bed and taken somewhere and beaten for no reason. Okay. Yeah. And the whole time he's beating me, he's reading from the Bible, because along with the rod, there's reproof. And so what we have is a maze where I believe that if I answer the questions the right way, that the punishment is going to end. And my older brother is telling me, it doesn't matter what you answer. It doesn't matter what you say or how you scream. Nothing matters. Okay.
Yeah.
But the thing is for the victim that's involved in that, all these head games and all the mind trips that these adults are doing, they're all completely believable. They're unable to see around it. And so the only people that can reach into that illusion and snap them out of their belief that the church and God are endorsing this is the pastor of the church. He needs to stand in the pulpit and make statements that make it impossible for these people to remain in the church. You see,
can I say an amen, preach it to that? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, well,
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Like that needs to be addressed. Like, and the only way that this can be addressed so clearly and profoundly is for more pastors and more elders and more leaders within the church to be recognizing and aware of the fact that this is a reality, and we need to be aware of the probability that people like your father look at churches as a safe haven to continue their activity.
They look at it as a grooming place. They look at it's a tool for manipulating their victims.
Right.
And so this is where, you know, the you have to understand that the anti-spanking community doesn't really represent the interests of tortured children, because tortured children need help right now. A third of them are going to die from their abuse before they reach 18. And so we don't have time for the whole society to get on board. I would love for every single parent to learn everything that I learned during my years of treatment and be able to approach their parenting the way that I can. But I tell you what I do appreciate is that a lot of parents are young and they are struggling financially and with a lot of other needs, and they're not really able to be learning. You know, I waited until I was almost 30 to begin dating and have a kid. So I had a lot of time to mature and develop experience and to grow through all of these things before I brought a child into my home. So, you know, one of the things we have to bear in mind is parents have to, or pastors and communities have to equip people who have kids. They might be 19 years old and working at a dead end job, and they still need to raise their kid. Yeah. So, you know, we can't have the solution to everything is that you have to get a psychology degree before you can have children. That's not reasonable either. But on the same token, there are simple things, and I can't be the one to write them. We need for pastors and for leaders in the Christian community to create the slogans and the words and phrases that we're going to say. That is, you know, if someone touches you in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable, well, here's what I would suggest is that when I would be punished, I would feel suicidal. I would want to kill myself when I got off the school bus, because the thought of going in the house and knowing that I wouldn't be able to get from the time that I walked through the door until bed without being beaten on something. And the thing is that it's not the beatings. The beatings, as horrible as they are, and it's the worst thing I ever experienced in my life. I've held my own dead child in my hand, and I'd do it 1,000 times before I would get whipped by my father again. It's the most awful experience that I can imagine. I can't even think of something worse. And yet, you know, when that is going on, you know what the real pain is? The emotional feeling that I have deserved this, that God wants me to feel this way because I have left the toilet seat up. Okay,
that dude, you're like make me cry here. Like that's
pretense.
Yeah.
And so when you see that, the thing is that with torture, what I want you to take away is that the main element of all torture is that it is psychological. So when you're looking at someone's body and trying to figure out if they've been abused or not, you're not understanding. Because what happens is, by the time that the body looks abused, their mind and their spirit has been destroyed.
Yeah.
By the time that you're seeing somebody, think about it in a movie. My dad was just like a serial killer that you see in a movie that keeps someone in a cage under their floorboard and tortures them. Except that he's got to send me out into the world every day so that I can go pretend to be alive. And then he brings me home and he's subjecting me to mock executions. He's telling me that he wants me to beg him to kill me. I'm so bad, I want you to kill me. And then beg him to leave me alive. Okay, please don't kill me. And what's his interest? Well, this is the definition of intrafamilial child torture, is that he wants total control of my psyche.
Yeah.
He wants to sit in the driver's seat of my spirit, my soul. He wants to be able to prove to himself that he can make me say or think or believe anything that he wants. He has made me into a puppet. And so when you see, where does he get this? How does he get me to go along with this? Well, this is where it comes from, is from a religious community that teaches in spanking. They teach people to break the will of a child. And if you are a mainline church or you are part of a Catholic church, you have probably never heard anything like it. But the thing is that it's so commonplace and so widespread, particularly among the Southern churches and among the charismatic. So I'm gonna read a little bit, and I'm gonna read this uninterrupted, so that I'm not editorializing about what they're saying.
Yeah.
Just to show this is page 144, and this is what the Bible says about child training. And the person who owned this wrote on the cover, "Soul training," with 3 underlines to show how important this is. Whipping needs to last as long as necessary for the child to acknowledge and accept his parents' right to rule him both then and in the future. Children vary as to the number and intensity of strokes they require. Some children are ready to give in when they first see the switch. A few strokes will suffice to help him remember better next time. However, the child who has not yet learned to trust his parents' commitment will require more frequent and intense whippings. Such a child is likely to require enough strokes to receive stripes or even welts. Some children have very sensitive skin that will welt or even bruise quite easily. Parents should not be overly concerned. So here you see that where what you think of,
and that was from you were reading from.
This is what the Bible says about child training. But I mean, I have probably 60 different parenting guides of this type.
Yeah.
And that's not unique or even particularly bad. It happened to be the first one on the top of the pile that I opened, and there was something highlighted. So, when you appreciate that,
it is reflective of a lot of that, though. I understand that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I understand too, though, that if you read the entirety of that book and you studied it very carefully, that you would probably come to the understanding that this guy isn't really telling people to torture their kids until they beg God to let them die. Okay.
Right.
But the trouble is that the idea that the rationale that makes that acceptable is the belief that children who are being abused will never be conscious or aware that this is being said.
Right.
And the reality is that this information is often intentionally put in front of their eyes. They are caused intentionally to come in contact with this material and to be contacting it in such a way as to intentionally deceive them as to the intent of the original author. And so arguing about what the author intended is to miss the point entirely. It doesn't matter that the author is intending. See, what you have to realize is
exactly right, Dolan. That's spot on. And that's immediately, and at the beginning of the show, that's what I don't know, maybe during the portion of it that I was muting myself on, unfortunately, but like immediately where most people's brains want to go,
right,
is well, that's not what they mean, or that's not
absolutely,
and that's not the point at all.
Well, and the thing is that gets confused because it crosses over into the debate about corporal punishment and what's reasonable or not, and so on. And that's a totally reasonable conversation to have. And I've already said where I personally fall on it is I don't think it's necessary at all. But here is, on the other hand, it's more important for me to focus on kids who are every single victim of child torture is suffering permanent, crippling, lifelong mental illness as a result, if they are not physically disfigured by it or killed. Okay. And so for us to be talking about anything else now, as far as spiritual, if you're worried about souls and spirits, let me tell you something. If somebody grows up in a building where it appears that every adult in this place is telling them that God wants them to be tortured horribly, to confront death on the carpet in the bedroom floor for no reason except to gratify some adult, and then you tell me that you can talk to someone who knows and sees everything, but he hasn't mentioned this to you at all, not to one of you, not to even one of you. Okay. So you see that it puts people into a position where, for me, like, I can't even engage with the debates that people have about religion and atheism, because to me it's so glaringly obvious from my experience that these people cannot possibly be communicating with any God, or they would know about what I am already telling you. And so the fact that this goes on, it just is like, I mean, I don't know, I'm locked out of believing that the people who wrote the book could possibly have any insight about anything. And it's a contagious problem. My position on faith is that I am now completely spiritually numb as a result of having grown up in an environment where the church became intimately involved into this psychodrama that my father created. And the thing is,
instead of putting a stop to it, I mean,
right. But see, now we know that when we catch adults who are pedophiles trying to groom children into some kind of romantic relationship, or tell them that it's a spiritual marriage, or like all of the cons, okay, is that we've become wise to these cons. We recognize them. And when adults begin trying to pull these things, when a man comes and starts, trying to get unusual opportunity to be alone with your kid, or taking more interest in your child than you have, and showering them with gifts, we recognize that as suspicious. And so what I'm saying is that in the military, you see, they ask for a volunteer and everyone steps back and leaves the one guy standing out. Is I am asking for everyone to take a step back and leave these child abusers standing out.
Right.
Is govern your own selves in a way that makes them conspicuously not like you. So when you're standing on your right to go right up to the legal line to do what the law will permit you, or what the least protective adult in town would allow you, when that's the standard that the church is allowing to prevail, okay, what we should be doing is that, listen, if you wouldn't let it happen to your kid, if you would go for blood or have the person arrested or sued if they did it to your kid, why are you uncomfortable with having that be a right? As opposed, see, what you're saying is that you want it to be a privilege that you have in your hand, that you hold, and you can grant it to your kid or take it away, and it's your privilege to give or take. If it was a right, then it wouldn't be excusable. There wouldn't be any way for the adult to have withdrawn it. So what happens is I call them spanking hypocrites. They don't abuse their own kids. They have a totally reasonable standard of how they corporally punish. They probably don't corporal punish at all, or if they ever did, it may have been once or twice. Okay. But the thing is that they're not calling for tortured victims to get the protection that they need from the law. They're not coming forward and saying, listen, man, all these rights that you've given me, I don't use those. I do not need to have the right to leave a bruise on my kid.
Right.
Okay. It's completely legal to leave bruises, to leave red marks and bloody welts. You could get investigated. CPS, what's CPS? It's a civil proceeding to keep you out of the criminal court. And so, it's completely unfair. CPS sucks. It's a horrible system, because the whole entire point of CPS is to deprive children of access to the regular courts that everybody else would use. If children had the same rights as everybody else, then when you assaulted them, they could just call the police and have you arrested. So, I'm not necessarily in favor of that. But what I'm saying is that parents, look at your own household and realize abused children live in the same community that you live in, and they have to live under the same rules that you create for your own child. So when you are telling your kid, well, you better not talk back to me, or else, when you're telling your kid it's yes, sir, and no, ma'am, okay, what you're doing is you're setting up for children who are abused that if they have some criticism against their parent, they better not voice it. Okay.
Even when the criticism may be 1,000 times more legitimate than what's
the
going
basis
on in your
of
home.
What's happening is that people are just assuming that all children are snug and safe and have a good protective adult. But we have a lot of children in the community that don't.
And so I tell you what, Dolan, I worked in education for a number of years, working with behavioral disorder students and special needs, and we dealt with a lot of students that live in traumatic homes. And what I learned working with these children, working with these families, and the training I went through had a profound impact on me as a parent when my daughter was finally born. And it has, and growing up in a family that corporal punishment was a thing for us. And I dealt with that as a kid, not nearly obviously to the extent that you did, but definitely was more of a norm in my life. And the contrast between the home I was raised in, not that I have any kind of hatred or just, despise my parents in any way. But yeah, we don't spank our daughter. And the attentiveness that I have now to recognizing the emotional needs of my daughter, and when she's acting out or when she's having trouble, even remotely considering why is that? She's 5, right? But why is that? I had not to make this portion here all about me, but when we just recently moved, she was absolutely mortified because we moved out of our house into a completely new space, new home, new everything. And it was extremely emotional for her. And I was able to recognize, and I credit the training that I had through the profession that I was coming out of as a big reason why I was able to recognize that her extreme reaction to it needed a different approach than me just going angrily, hey, shut up, stop crying, whatever, and like being abusive, verbally or physically, but recognizing, hey, like she's suffering some serious emotional loss right now. She's 5, but she's experiencing some extremely deep and difficult emotions that she's never really felt before because she's saying goodbye to the only thing that she's ever known. And she needs to know that she's not doing it alone. Like she needs to know that it's normal to feel that way, that mommy and daddy feel that way too. That, like recognizing and
that's a modern way of parenting.
Right. That's exactly right.
Right.
And I didn't know, with all due respect to my friends and pastors and ministry, I didn't learn that in the church. I learned that from my profession working in, with professionals and professional counselors.
Well,
and
I
dealing
have
with
met
students
enough Christians who were raised in the church who have very good things to say about their upbringing and their parents, in spite of being spanked, that I really believe that there are a lot of people that for them that experience, it was a good thing for them.
Yeah.
And, without saying anything
and it
negative
wasn't
about
necessarily
that,
bad or traumatic necessarily for me, but I mean, I feel like I'm able to take a different and I feel a much better approach.
Well, that brings another issue, which is, when you're talking about parenting and the parenting war, really in the long term, the last 4 generations, you have seen people moving increasingly away from these traditional religious parenting models.
Yeah.
It's been more drastic with the millennials and the Generation X, but it has been steadily moving in that direction. So this, I think, reflects, though, the unwillingness of church communities to deal with the minorities of people who are having negative experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the attention is focused exclusively on the way that the bulk of the people in the congregation are doing and not onto the small numbers of people that are having a problematic issue within the church, it's easy to ignore when civilization is like a little island, like a city state, and you can throw out the complainers into the wilderness and then no one ever sees or talks to them again.
Yep.
But now with the internet, when you throw us out, what happens is now there's more of us out than in. And all
you
the
find
people
each other.
Right. They all group up together and they find each other on Facebook and they form into little colonies of people and it's not that they're sitting around and nursing complaints and that they're bitter and angry and blah, blah, blah. What's happened is that they came out and they went to a secular psychiatrist and they sought treatment. So when I go to treatment, I'm not going to see like a Freudian psychologist where I'm sitting in an office and boohooing about my mommy and daddy all the time. That's not what goes on. This is a group of other people that are there because they're struggling. They're having anger management issues or drinking problems or some other kind of issue. And when I come in, there's a person who is a client who demonstrates to me the very basic, simple, brief psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time that I'm done going through this, I can present and teach this to somebody else. And this becomes the main tool that I use to approach all of my life and all of my challenges. And when I come to my parenting, well, after years of participating in group therapy, our family basically relates to each other like a therapy group. All we do all day is give and receive confrontations, and we hit each other with our bad behavior, and we go through. I used to think I would have to sit down with my daughter in a chalkboard and like do the ABCs and dispute her irrational beliefs and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't really need to, because we do it informally. Every time there's a behavior interaction, is I'm going through with her and discussing her self-talk, and then I'm helping her to understand how all this works. So what happens is, by the time you have a 3-year-old, you have a basic understanding of what it is to live in a community with other people. And by the time you have a 5-year-old, this is basically someone who understands being in a household and living in a community. And, by the time my daughter is 10, it's like, well, now we're really just refining. She's specializing into what is going to ultimately turn out to be her full personality.
Yeah.
But,
like
when
her,
I look,
her uniqueness and her part of what is, she's contributing to that community that she's in, which is her family. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways that people can have a harmonious household.
Mm-hmm.
And, the main point of this is to say to people, realizing that if you would like to have people join your religion and your church, then you have to be able to present that that's a lifestyle choice that shows people a path to success and harmony and happiness.
Yeah.
And so while there are so many people outside the church, they're all pointing their finger back at the church, and they're saying, I was harmed and injured in this location. And it wasn't by people who were secretly abusing children in a nursery or in a care program. They were injured, like I was, by the words that the pastor was saying in the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the fellow that was on a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about being gay in the church. Well, where's the problem coming from? It's not people secretly attacking him outside of the church. It's the words coming from the pulpit.
Yeah.
The problem for the purity culture, it's the words that are coming from the pulpit. And so when these people leave from the church, they're not really coming back. I think that there's a real common perception.
True.
There's a common misperception among Christians that an atheist is the same thing as a backslidden Christian. And, when Oz was on the show, the episode with Oz, he was talking about being a backslidden Christian before he became an atheist, and how clear the distinction is to someone who is an atheist between being backslidden and actually losing your faith.
Yeah.
Well, in the same way, there's a big difference between my peer group, which are all parents who are spending money to put their kid into a child-centered school. They're focused on producing a household that's based on the principles of egalitarian parenting and non-authoritarian parenting. Okay. And someone who is essentially a Christian who has decided to stop spanking. Yeah. And so what they've done is they have kept every aspect of the parenting tradition, all of the underlying ideology, the belief in the supremacy of parents and the right to rule your kids, and the idea that hierarchical structured authority is a necessity, that you must be trained to obey authorities. You see, I'm self-employed. I don't have a boss. So I don't punch a time clock, and you see, my experiences with authority as a kid were so horrifying. Every authority that I was involved in my abuse. The pastor was involved in it, and my mother and father were involved in it. The policemen who came to the home, they were also manipulated into being co-conspirators with my father. And so to me, what I saw was that to me, authority doesn't feel like a team where there's a coach who helps everybody along.
Right.
It feels like a relationship of slavery. So when I am approached by a police officer, as soon as I see him, I'm already ready to fight, because just the mere fact that he is a representative of authority, to me, he's already suspicious. To me, the reason that people are interested in having a position of authority is because they want to have some position from which to abuse other people.
Yeah.
So
they are attracted to a position of authority if for nothing
right.
else.
So
Yeah.
you know, everyone tells me that
that.
I'm paranoid, and I understand that that's how people perceive it, but appreciate that this paranoia has become a political and social movement. This is when you're looking at the defund the police and all of the rest of this, is there's a widespread belief that authorities are just invalid. And a big reason for it is that the figures of authority within the religious community that people relied on as the standard bearers for what it was to do right and wrong are not making the effort to step forward and admit when they have made errors.
Right.
Is that it's just that simple.
Thank you. Another amen coming from me.
Right. Is that it's only that simple. Is that, and so this brings us to the, you know, the issue of, you know, how do you move the church forward? Well, the way that you move forward,
that was kind of going to be
you have to ultimately decide in yourself. You have to decide that we're going to acknowledge that the people who have been criticizing the church have been rightly pointing to something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Preach it.
And so
I'd be giving you a standing ovation right now if I didn't think I'd bump into my mic.
There's a bit there. Well, you know, I have a lot of fellow advocates who are Christians, you know, because I'm an atheist and I'm the angry kind of atheist. You know, I'm not angry at you for being Christian, and I don't want to destroy your church, but I want the things that are assisting child abuse to stop.
Right.
And from my perspective, if destroying the church is what it takes to make it stop, then so be it. Okay. But there's a big difference between wanting to destroy the church because I hate the church, and then I'm going to use child abuse as a reason to do that. That's not me.
I would echo and agree with that exact sentiment, because if that type of church is what exists, then that's not the kind of church that Jesus died for and came to build anyway.
Absolutely. And if that's not what your church is like, that's not what your church is like, then you need to be louder.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Because when what happens is that you're perfectly allowed. You see, I can't prevent children who are being groomed using these materials from encountering them, because you guys are blasting them out of the TV and the radio and the internet. You're putting ads on YouTube, and all you're doing is promoting what you believe to be a return to family values and good right living and good healthy families is your goal. But the trouble is that while you're doing that, kids who are being abused are receiving these same messages. And what you're doing is you're endorsing a return to a society where, if you think about it, you know, the 1950s was a real dark period of history for children. You had the Catholic sex abuse scandals were going on in Ireland. You were having issues going on with the orphanages. You have really an epidemic of child abuse in every single child care setting. You have the teen homes where birth mothers were having their children taken from them and thrown into a septic tank. Hundreds of bodies of infants found. The Catholic Church, the Irish government recently did an inquest, and they're calling it the Irish Holocaust. Is the Irish Church or the Catholic Church being placed in charge of their orphanages? So many children were abused. They identified 200,000 victims of abuse in Catholic institutions in France just about a month ago. So, you know, these things, what the church members need to realize is that for a lot of people, if they are second generation outside of the church, then they hear from their parents a story like I am telling. Is I was a gay person who was in the church, and all my parents did was torture me psychologically by trying to convert me and make me into something that I wasn't. And I finally had to excommunicate from the church and abandon my family in order to be happy. Right. And so when you hear that, understand that my kid sees me writhing in agony every day because of the physical abuse that I suffered. And so you're not going to get her on board with the idea that I'm confused about what happened to me when I was a kid and I don't know who was responsible. She's witnessed and experienced it. The same with my wife. You know, all of my extended family members after 15 years of marriage, you know, it's day in and day out. I am sick with PTSD every day. It's the most significant aspect of my life every day. So, you know, people who want to come and follow me on Facebook, every post that I make on Facebook is public. So I want you to watch me raise my daughter and go back and scroll through my feed and look at years of me raising my kid without God and realize that other people are doing the same thing. Millions of people are doing it. And so you have got to offer and show.
We as Christians who believe in God, that doesn't necessarily have to be viewed as a threat. And that doesn't necessarily have to be viewed as something that we can't learn from. We can learn from that.
Yeah,
and that's the thing.
You can't continue to have the bad press of having your own children are the leaders of the organizations that oppose you.
Right, exactly.
Is that when it's, and see, the thing is when I say your own children, well, this is the thing. When I say that I was abused at the church, you know what church people tell me is that my abuser wasn't a real Christian.
Right.
But the implication behind that is that I was not a real Christian.
Yeah.
Okay, you understand who's the victim. The issue is not the religion of the offender. I don't argue my offender was not behaving like a Christian in any way.
Yeah.
And he was not doing what his pastor was asking him to do in any way. He wasn't following their instructions. But the thing is that you have to understand the responsibility is between the church members, and the child.
Yeah.
That you cannot have a child abuser be the person who you're making responsible for protecting the kid from himself.
So that should be a self-evident no-brainer, but it's not for some people. That's
the reason why it doesn't make sense is because a physical abuser who feels remorseful and is just dealing with normal parenting stresses could be rehabilitated. And so people will attempt to rehabilitate a physical abuser. Yeah. But if you are able to listen closely and study and ask an open-ended question. So what eventually happened is the psychologist, my mom, she took me and my brother from Michigan all the way to Texas. We lived in the desert for 9 months, and she still wouldn't divorce our father because she was so caught up into this church. They didn't believe in divorce. But she couldn't stand watching us get beaten and getting beaten herself. So we went and we moved. We lived in the desert. We would get our mail general delivery so that if he came there, he would find a big mailbox with hundreds of people's mail in there. He couldn't locate where we physically were at. So from here, she's negotiating for our return. And the condition of our return is that he has to go and get counseling from somebody that is not the church, a secular person. So the person that he went to see, we eventually reconciled. And he started abusing us literally within days. We had a vacation to Florida that was supposed to be like a little honeymoon for everybody to get reacquainted after we'd been living separately for nearly a year. And he was already he was beating my brother in the hotel in Orlando. So we didn't make it through that. Well, when we get back to our home in Michigan, the counselor basically, when my dad would be beating me, whatever thing he was thinking would be falling out of his mouth. So him and my mom are doing counseling, and then she's going off to her job as a waitress, and he is whipping me, and I am hearing the discussion, what he wishes that he would have said to that counselor during the meeting. And essentially, though, that counselor was the first one to say to him an open-ended question, just describe to me what is it when you're spanking your kid. And when he got to the end, the man said to my father, what you've just described, if you were to do that to an enemy combatant in a war, you would be brought up on charges at The Hague and you could be executed for torture. Now, our pastor, what he's teaching is that you need to break the child's will. And the way that you're going to know that you've broken the child's will is that the sound of their screaming is going to change, and it's going to be a defeated whimper. And so here is me. That is
torture. Hello.
Here is me trying to scream in every possible way that I can imagine. I've
just
heard
to make
this.
It stop. Yeah.
Right. I'm trying to what is the tone of voice? What's the magic word, man? How do you make this stop?
What frequency do I have to hit in order for this to stop?
Right.
Good God.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and then they say, well, if you're whipping your kid, they should cry for a minute or two or less. So if you cry for too long, then the whipping continues. And, if you move your hands or your feet, or you don't move around, then the whipping has to start over. You start from the beginning. And so when we're going in and my mom is reporting to the pastor that I'm screaming and I'm trying to climb out through the window and I'm kicking and biting and scratching. And so now the minister is telling me, well, what's going to happen is that if you stand still for your punishment, then it will be not very bad. But if you start jumping and moving and making a lot of noise, then you're going to have to get more of a punishment.
Yeah.
And so here is Dad, and now he's reading from the Bible. He says, your punishment will be 7 times worse. And if you still won't obey, then it's 7 times. And then eventually it's, you'll be, if you hear a leaf, you'll be in terror if you hear the wind blow a leaf. And, the thing is that I'm totally into what he's saying, believing that I could somehow answer his questions in a way that's going to make this stop.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that I have been told that there's the rod and reproof, and that he has to give me these lessons, because you can't just beat your kid. You have to teach them something in the course of this.
Right.
And so we're looking at a whipping that goes on for an hour or 2, or maybe even longer. He might leave and eat and come back later. Okay. So, and back and forth between my brother and me. So I'm in the other room listening to my brother getting tortured, and then knowing that I'm going to be next and waiting to see, it's just the nightmare of going through all of that. And then to go into the church, and the thing is in the church, it's treated as if you get a little carried away, you could apologize.
Right.
But
that again goes to where like the environment of forgiveness and acknowledging your sin and all of that stuff can become an environment that for people like your father, they thrive in that community by making it look like you're being confessional and making it look like you're going to change, but there's no change actually happening, and the cycle just continues and continues and continues.
Well, and the thing of the church is obviously not intending to be causing anything like that to happen. That's not the goal. But as we have found in dealing with sex offenders, you have got to make every effort to be a step ahead of them, number one. And number 2, to be prepared to recognize that you have made an error. The thing is that, of course, we want to do background checks and screen people and ask for references and everything before we employ a volunteer working with children. But we also have to be willing to acknowledge that, oh my gosh, we've really done it this time. We've hired the wrong guy, and now he's doing things that are inappropriate.
Instead of acknowledging, instead of seeing it and then going, oh shoot, we can't let people know about this. How do we cover this up, or how do we hide this, or how do we save face, and etc. So
Focus on the Family says that they don't want to make the church an uninviting place for people who are looking for help. So what they mean by this is that if you're the type of parent that's a frustrated, angry parent who's stressed out, you could possibly benefit from getting this advice, and they want you to be welcome to come in. But the thing is that in the process of advertising, in the process of helping that person, are you also becoming an accomplice to abusing someone else?
Right.
And so
this is where I want to say, and we can kind of near wrapping this up.
Yeah, sure. I'm ready for that.
If you're, I know you don't stay up this late usually. So, but I do want to say this to the point that I think you've been making, but maybe I'll add some scripture to this to try and hopefully connect with and speak some sense into the Christians that are listening. 1 Corinthians 6 verses 12 says, everything is permissible for me. This is Paul talking, but not all things are beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything and brought under its power, allowing it to control me. Here's the thing. The whole spanking, the whole corporal punishment, and like all of this stuff that has been so intensely and intricately a part of the church's approach to parenting for so long. How much of that is desirable to your parenting approach because you like the idea of being in control and having a kid that just does what you say? How much of that is centered around this attitude that you're the authoritarian, you're in charge, your word is law, king of your castle, and the Bible says it's permissible, so yeah, this is how I'm running my home. To you, I would say not everything that's permissible is beneficial. Risking creating an environment and a norm that people like Dolan look at in the church and use that as justification for psychologically being traumatized and abused and thinking that they deserve it. Or that sort of behavior, that sort of justification, that sort of norm in your approach to running your household is something that abusive people like Dolan's father use to then justify and manipulate their own home to perpetuate the abuse. So what I'm saying is, yeah, maybe this isn't a problem for you in your home. Maybe you're not someone like Dolan's father. But is it really beneficial for the church to continue on approaching parenting in this way that allows situations like what Dolan has experienced in his life to continue on? Is it really worth it? Or are there other approaches that are not unbiblical just because it's not 100% the way that the church has taught and done parenting for forever doesn't necessarily mean it's unbiblical or the wrong way to do things. Is there a better way to do it that doesn't allow the door to be open for things like what Dolan has experienced and gone through to continue existing, and allow that to be a safe haven, allow your church, your congregation to be a safe haven for people like Dolan and his father and his family to exist, and for stories like his to continue in the church? That shouldn't be the case. So that's me on my soapbox, Dolan.
Well, honestly, I am just blown away because I think that I have never in all of my years heard anyone give me back a readout of my own material that was so spot on.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Well, I'm impressed with myself that I was able to explain it to anyone as well as that, because that
there
really is it.
Dude.
I would like for everybody to consider what you could do, to hear what I've said, and to just consider what you in your home, in your church, in your sphere of influence, what do you have control over? If you're the jury on the case, then you have some control over that. If you're hearing a child making a disclosure that sounds like mine, when you hear my disclosure, it means that when you hear it again, it sounds believable. So, it's been the case. What I've discovered is when I come forward and I begin talking negatively about spanking in public, a mob of Christians appears to yell and shout and silence me, because they're more interested in defending spanking as a concept and a right for parents. And so, all you really need to do when victims like me are coming forward, when someone says, I had a negative experience of being spanked, legal spanking that was not prosecutable has left tens of millions of Americans with permanent emotional injuries. And if you're in a family where people whip their kids with belts and sticks and paddles, I am just about certain that there's someone in your family that is suffering from a problem caused by that. It's Uncle Joe who's got her. Grandpa was never right. Okay, there's somebody in your family. So you're aware, first of all, that this occurs and how profoundly it affects people. My father was affected by being whipped when he was a kid. I don't know that his dad did to him what he did to me. But the thing is that when you realize that this is going on and you understand it, you have to take a step back and think that culturally we have allowed for there to be norms where we speak publicly about victims of horrible, severe crime, and there is no thought process that the victims are present. And today, when you're on the internet, you're sharing the internet with the victims of the crimes that you're reading about in the newspaper. So when you read these horrible stories about children in homeschool where they're in cages and they're being tortured, those children don't vanish when the story vanishes from the headlines.
Right.
Those are still living human beings, and they're on the internet and they're reading your comments.
That's exactly right.
And they're judging and forming opinions about the entire religion. Whereas to you, your particular church is quite distinct and separate from every other church in town. And these churches are different from other denominations. To people who are outside of religion, it's a blob. It's one thing.
True. That's true.
Okay. And so the thing of you describing how your particular authorities in your location are different, it's meaningless to me unless you're taking the side of the oppressed in public with money and time and attention. If you're lobbying and you're looking at legislation and you're supporting victims of abuse over their oppressors, then you're representing Christianity to the public in a way that shows Christianity to be beneficial.
Right.
But basically what Christianity is doing right now, in my estimation, what I see is they're coming to me with a hat and wanting me to put money in it. And I have barely escaped from your church with my life.
Right.
I nearly was murdered inside of that place because of the teachings and the way that your society was structured. There is no way in the world that I am going to support the ministry.
And the kind of benefit that they may be having for other people still doesn't negate the fact that they are ignoring or sweeping under the rug or allowing the environment that created what you went through to exist and persist. They're still not dealing with that.
And
why would you give to that, right? Why would you support
well, and
that?
if it's a good thing and it does benefits for society, then it should continue to exist.
Yeah.
But in order for it to continue to exist, the thing is that if you don't find the claims that I'm making credible, please go and read some statistics about the decline of religion in America.
Yeah.
Realize that religious attendance has declined by more than 50% in 20 years.
Massively.
And that's basically straight down after 1,000 years.
And
COVID
has exposed a lot of the inequity that the church is having a hard time recovering from. So
when you look at the figures, they juggle the numbers. These religious communities are juggling the numbers because there's a vast gulf in the figures between older people, older than 55, and people who are younger than 30.
Yeah.
So if we subtract out of there all great grandpa and grandpa who were very religious, and we only look at the people under 55, the swing has been even greater.
Yeah.
And so if I could put any point, is that if you're interested in evangelism and spreading the gospel and growing the church and having a social influence that isn't diminishing, the only thing that you need to do is you need to look inside of your own community and figure out how to keep your own children from leaving. Because if you cannot retain your own children and your own offspring, there is no possible way that you're going to recruit people from outside. The people that are out of the church now, they're not like backslidden Christians.
Yeah.
They are hardened into their form because they have...
And they know the church. Like, that's the thing.
Correct.
They know the Bible, they know the church, they know the teaching, and they're still leaving.
They're leaving because of that. They're leaving because of what they're hearing in the pulpit. And see, I don't think it's not because the church is bad and has rotten teaching necessarily. It's primarily because the small numbers of people who are harmed. It's just what it is in the Bible, is you got to go after the one sheep. As if they were going after the one sheep, then they wouldn't be worried about the 99. But because that one sheep has been neglected, now all of a sudden you're looking,
and then all the other sheep looking at that, going,
"Am I safe?
What the heck happened there? I guess this is not the space for me either. I'm out of here too."
That's correct. I want to make the point is that what people need to realize is that overwhelmingly, who is leading the people out of the church are survivors of child abuse, because they leave the church with a chip on their shoulder and already a negative impression of it because they were abused by church members. And then they immediately go to secular psychologists who begin to present them literally the most atheistic worldview that you can possibly imagine is what you're going to get from secular therapy. And it would be wonderful for Christians if that was a huge failure and it never worked. But unfortunately, it works all the time. It works really good. And so because it helps people, they then turn into the next generation of people, and they raise a generation that are even more atheistic than the ones before. And that is the position where we're standing in now. And if the church doesn't take steps to actually reverse the procedure, and I don't think that you can possibly reverse it without going back to the beginning, and the beginning of it is your own kids. And when I say own, I don't mean your biological children that live in your home. What I mean is that you need to begin to see the children who are abused in your church by members that you don't feel are Christian. Those children are the children of the church. The church is responsible for protecting them.
And to them, if you're saying that they're not, those parents and those people are not Christian, well, to those kids, they are. That's the thing.
Well, the way that they have suggested that you protect children from physical abuse is by educating parents about the right way to spank.
Yeah.
But what that does is it puts the perpetrator in charge of being the one to rescue. The perpetrator is supposed to rescue the victim. So you appreciate that that is not really it's not really a solution. In fact,
totally wrong way to do it.
Well, in fact, what it is a complete abdication of responsibility, because the other adults that are surrounding the abused kid, this is when we're talking about mandatory reporter. When I say that every adult who sees a child is responsible to protect them from abuse, increasingly juries and judges and legislatures are seeing it that way. Is that if you are in awareness that there's a child who's being abused, why in the world would you not be reporting that?
Exactly.
Well, in the same way, when someone says, I don't want to stand in the pulpit and say to children, if your parent is spanking you and afterwards you want to murder yourself or kill your parent or run away from home, if you feel so much grief about spankings that happened a long time ago that you're crying about it weeks later, these are not normal things that children experience. A spanking is usually a fairly minor event. People go and this happens. Like, people even choose to get spanked over other punishments. It's not the worst thing that ever happened to them in their life. And what happens is that when you suggest to pastors that you could openly say stuff like that, they don't want to do it the same way that they didn't want to talk to children about sexual abuse or tell them the names of their body parts.
Yeah.
And so,
or talk about mental illness and mental health and depression,
but you see
and suicide,
that in the
meanwhile,
in the meanwhile, the rest of the world moves forward. And so, because the rest of the world
and
has
actually helping people, like, that's the thing, they move forward and actually help people.
The rest of the world has already decided that if I say to everybody that I never hit my kid, how many children have reported sexual abuse after seeing a presentation at school about sexual abuse? But more children report their friend has been sexually abused because they saw a presentation about sexual abuse at school. You see, when a child has a disclosure to another friend and the friend recognizes that there's something wrong with it, then the friend can be helpful too. Exactly. But what happens is, if the reason why parents, what happens is that people who spank their kids and hit them with sticks and boards and belts, they worry that if the church starts telling kids about the fact that some kids are seriously injured and lifelong injuries result from this exact kind of treatment that looks exactly like what we're describing, well, then their kids might get confused and go and improperly report them for child abuse, and they could have an inconvenient encounter with law enforcement. Well, this is a concern that needs to be addressed without throwing a bunch of children onto the altar to sacrifice them for your convenience. Right. Exactly. There's another method has to be figured out that protects children too.
I might also address and acknowledge the fact that the system that does exist for investigating and looking into and determining, these types of, intense child abuse that's taking place, like, let the process play out, especially if you know for a fact that you are obviously not an abusive person, that, like Dolan's parents. Like, if you're afraid of having that sort of stuff come up in conversation because you think, or taught at a church because you think your kids are going to get, somehow say something or do something that's going to get you starting to talk with, DCFS or whatever, don't be afraid of that. Don't. Because the reality is, it's, if there's nothing to hide at all, if you're really not an abusive person and you're not abusing your kids, let the process play out. They'll find out that there was nothing, and that's actually on your record, like, that's there. So, oh, did I just lose Dolan again? Shoot. I just lost Dolan. I think we're nearing the end of the broadcast, though. We're about 2.5 hours in. This has gone a lot longer than I anticipated. But I do think we'll wrap it up there. Usually, I ask my guests to end with finishing the sentence, "Dear Christians," and responding to the whole of Christianity on this topic. I think Dolan already answered that, though. I really do. I think he responded to it pretty clearly already. And so I am extremely grateful, Dolan, for you coming on the show, and thank you very much for sharing your story, sharing your insight. And I very much look forward to continuing this conversation with more people. And hopefully this conversation is something that you are able to take with you to be able to facilitate this extremely important discussion with other Christians, especially, who need to have this discussion and have this honest conversation about parenting and the approach that we're taking to parenting within Christian culture that is, for lack of a better term, allowing abusive people like Dolan's father to see it as a safe haven that perpetuates their abuse. We need to be aware of that so we can put a stop to it. So thank you all for chiming in. And if we didn't get to any of your questions, I know we had some questions in the chat. Unfortunately, Dolan lost his connection, so we will have to get to that a little bit later. Maybe we'll put a little bonus out there on the audio stream, and you guys can hear that later. But we're going to sign off for the evening. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a wonderful night.